Initiatic Affiliation by René Guénon. Most of our contemporaries, at least in the West, find certain matters so hard to understand that we are obliged to return to them repeatedly. And quite often these matters, which are at the root of all that is related to the traditional point of view in general, or more especially to the esoteric and initiatic point of view in particular, are also of an order that ought normally to be regarded as rather elementary. Such, for example, is the question of the role and inherent efficacy of rites. And perhaps it is, at least in part, because of its rather close involvement with rites that the question of the need for initiatic affiliation seems to be in the same situation. Indeed, when one understands that initiation consists essentially in the transmission of a certain spiritual influence, and that this transmission can only be operated by means of a rite, which is precisely what effectuates the affiliation one has to an organization that as its chief function conserves and communicates this influence, it does seem that there should no longer be any difficulty in this respect, for transmission and affiliation are fundamentally only the two inverse aspects of one and the same thing, according to whether it is envisaged as descending or ascending the initiatic chain. Recently, however, we have had occasion to ascertain that this difficulty exists even for some who, in fact, have such an affiliation. This may seem rather astonishing, but we doubtless see here one result of the speculative diminishment that the organization to which they belong has undergone, for it is obvious that for anyone who confines himself to this single speculative point of view, questions of this order, as well as all those that might properly be called technical, will only appear in a very indirect and distant perspective, and it is also clear that by this very fact their fundamental importance risks being more or less completely misunderstood. We might even say that such an example enables us to measure the distance separating virtual from effective initiation. Not, of course, that the former can be regarded as negligible, for quite the contrary. It is this that constitutes initiation properly speaking, the indispensable beginning, initium, that carries with it the possibility of all later developments. But we have to recognize that, especially under present conditions, it is very far indeed from this virtual initiation to the slightest hint of realization. However this may be, we think we have already sufficiently explained the need for initiatic affiliation. Footnote: see Perspectives on Initiation, especially chapters 5 and 8. But in the face of certain questions still being asked on this topic, it will be useful to add a few points of detail to complement what we have already said. We must first of all set aside the objection that some might be tempted to draw from the fact that the neophyte in no way experiences the spiritual influence at the actual moment of its reception. To tell the truth, this case is quite comparable to that of certain rites of an exoteric order, such, for example, as the religious rites of ordination, where a spiritual influence is also transmitted and, at least in a general way, is no longer experienced either, which does not prevent it from being truly present and conferring upon those who receive it certain aptitudes that they would not have possessed without it. But in the initiatic order we must go further. In a way it would be contradictory for the neophyte to be aware of the transmitted influence, since with respect to this influence, as well as by definition, he is still in a purely potential and non-developed state, whereas the capacity to experience it would, on the contrary, necessarily imply a certain degree of development or actualization. And this is why we have just said that one must begin with a virtual initiation. But in the exoteric domain, there is in fact no disadvantage in not having any conscious awareness of the influence received, even indirectly and in its effects, since in this domain it is not a matter of obtaining an effective spiritual development as a result of the effected transmission. On the other hand, it is an altogether different matter when it is a question of initiation, and hence the interior work of the initiate, for ultimately the effects of this work should be felt, and this is precisely what constitutes the passage to effective initiation, at whatever degree it might be envisaged. This is at least what ought to take place normally if the initiation is to yield the results rightly expected from it. It is true that in most cases initiation remains forever virtual, which amounts to saying that the above-mentioned effects remain in a latent state indefinitely. But if this is the case, it is nonetheless an anomaly from a strictly initiatic point of view, and due only to certain contingent circumstances. Footnote: one could say in a general way, moreover, that in the conditions of an age like ours, it is almost always the truly normal case that from the traditional point of view appears as the exception. As, for instance, an initiate's insufficient qualifications, that is, the limitation of those possibilities which he bears within himself, and for which nothing external can make up. or again the state of imperfection or degeneration to which certain initiatic organizations are reduced at the present time, and which prevents them from furnishing sufficient support for the attainment of effective initiation, so that even the existence of such an initiation is unsuspected by those who might otherwise be qualified for it, although these organizations do remain capable of conferring a virtual initiation, that is, of assuring the initial transmission of a spiritual influence to those who possess the minimum of the indispensable qualifications. Incidentally, and before passing to another aspect of the question, we should add that, as we have already expressly noted, this transmission does not and cannot have anything magical about it, for the very reason that it is essentially a matter of a spiritual influence, whereas everything of a magical order is concerned exclusively with the manipulation of psychic influences. Even if it happens that the spiritual influence is accompanied secondarily by certain psychic influences, this changes nothing, for it amounts to no more than a purely accidental result, due only to the correspondence that always necessarily obtains between different orders of reality. In all cases, initiatic rites do not act on or by means of these psychic influences, but stem solely from spiritual influences, and precisely insofar as they are initiatic, could not have any raison d'être outside of the latter. The same is also true, moreover, in the exoteric domain concerning religious rites. Footnote: It goes without saying that the same holds true for exoteric rites in traditions other than those clothed in a religious form. If we speak more particularly of religious rites here, it is because in this domain they represent the most generally known cases in the West. And regarding these, as well as initiatic rites, whatever differences there may be between spiritual influences, either in themselves or with respect to the various ends to which they are directed, it is still properly a matter of spiritual influences. This suffices to show that they have nothing in common with magic, which is only a secondary traditional science of an altogether contingent and even of a very inferior order, and which is, we repeat, entirely foreign to everything that has to do with the spiritual domain. We now come to what seems the most important point, one that touches most closely on the very root of the question, which, seen from this angle, might be formulated thus: nothing can be separated from the principle, for if it were, it would truly be without existence or reality, even in the smallest degree. How then can one speak of an affiliation, whatever may be the intermediaries by which it is effected? For ultimately this could only be conceived of as a link to the principle itself, which, to take the word in its literal meaning, seems to imply the re-establishment of a link that had been broken. A question of this type is quite similar to another that has also been asked. Why do we need to make an effort to attain deliverance, since the self, Atma, is immutable and remains always the same, and could not in any way be modified or affected by anything whatsoever? Those who raise such questions show that they have stopped at a much too exclusively theoretical and thereby one-sided view of things, or else that they have confused two points of view which, however, are clearly distinct, although complementary to each other in a certain sense, the principial point of view and that of manifested beings. Assuredly, from the metaphysical point of view, one could, if need be, confine oneself to the principial aspect only, and as it were neglect all the rest. But the properly initiatic point of view, on the contrary, must start from conditions that are those of manifested beings here and now, and more precisely of human individuals as such, the very conditions, that is, from which it would have them liberate themselves. Thus, it must necessarily take into consideration, and this is what distinguishes this point of view from that of pure metaphysics, what might be called a state of fact, and in some way link it to the principial order. To avoid any ambiguity on this point, we should say this: it is evident that in the principle nothing could ever be subject to change, and so it is not the self that must be liberated, since it is never conditioned, or subject to any limitation, but rather the ego, and it can only be liberated by dissipating the illusion that makes it seem separate from the self. Similarly, it is not really the link with the principle that must be re-established, since it always exists and cannot cease to exist. Footnote: this link is basically none other than the Sutratma of the Hindu tradition, which we have mentioned in other studies. But for the manifested being, it is the effective consciousness of this link that has to be realized. And in view of the present condition of humanity, there are no other possible means for this than those provided by initiation. Hence, one can understand that the necessity for an initiatic affiliation is not one of principle, but only of fact, though one that is nonetheless rigorously indispensable in our present state, and which we are consequently obliged to take as a starting point. Besides, for the men of primordial times, initiation would have been useless and even inconceivable, since spiritual development in all its degrees was accomplished among them in an altogether natural and spontaneous way by reason of their proximity to the principle. But as a result of the descent that has occurred since then, in conformity with the inevitable process of all cosmic manifestation, the conditions of the cyclic period in which we find ourselves at present are altogether different, and this is why the restoration of the possibilities of the primordial state is the first of the goals that initiation sets itself. Footnote: on initiation considered in connection with the lesser mysteries as enabling the accomplishment of a reascent of the cycle by successive stages back to the primordial state, see Perspectives on Initiation, Chapter 40. It is therefore in taking account of these conditions, such as they are, in fact, that we must affirm the necessity of an initiatic affiliation, and not in a general way and without further qualification as to the conditions of the age, or even more of the world concerned. In this connection, we would call attention more especially to what we have said elsewhere about the possibility that living beings might be born of themselves, without parents. Footnote: Perspectives on Initiation, Chapter 4. This spontaneous generation is indeed a possibility in principle, and we can very well conceive a world where it would actually be so. But this is not an actual possibility in our world, at least, to be more precise, in its present state. It is the same for the attainment of certain spiritual states, which, moreover, is also a kind of birth. Footnote: in this regard, there is hardly need to recall everything we have said elsewhere on initiation, considered as a second birth. Moreover, this manner of envisaging things is common to all traditional forms without exception. And this comparison seems both the most exact and the best suited to help us understand what is involved. In the same order of ideas, we will also say this: in the present state of our world, the earth is unable to produce a plant of itself and spontaneously, except from a seed deriving necessarily from a pre-existing plant. Footnote: let us point out, without being able to stress the point just now, that this is not unrelated to the grains of wheat of Eleusis, or in Masonry to the password of the grade of companion. The initiatic application is, moreover, obviously closely related to the idea of spiritual posterity. In this respect, it is perhaps not without interest to note also that the word neophyte means literally new plant. Nevertheless, the former case must have obtained at one time, for otherwise there could have been no beginning, although at present this possibility is no longer among those susceptible of manifestation. In the conditions in which we now in fact exist, no one can reap without first having sown, and this is just as true spiritually as it is materially. Now, the seed that must be planted in our being in order to make possible our subsequent spiritual development is precisely the influence which, in a state of virtuality and envelopment exactly comparable to that of a plant seed, footnote, it is not that the spiritual influence in itself can ever be in a state of potentiality, but that the neophyte receives it in a manner somehow proportioned to his own state, is communicated to us by initiation. Footnote: we could even add that by reason of the correspondence that obtains between the cosmic order and the human order, there can be between the two terms of comparison that we have just indicated not just a similarity, but a much closer and more direct relationship of such a nature as to justify it even more completely. And from this we can begin to see that the biblical text in which fallen man is represented as condemned to being no longer able to harvest anything from the soil without hard labor, Genesis 3:17-19, may well correspond to a truth, even in its most literal sense. At this point, it will be profitable to point out an error of which several examples have turned up recently. Some people believe that affiliation with an initiatic organization is in some way merely a first step toward initiation. This would only be true on condition that we clearly specify that this is the case with effective initiation. But the people in question do not make any distinction between virtual initiation and effective initiation, and perhaps do not even have the faintest notion of such a distinction, which, however, is of the greatest importance and even, one might say, altogether essential. Besides, it is quite possible that they have been more or less influenced by certain conceptions of occultist or theosophist provenance concerning the great initiates and other things of this kind, which are assuredly apt to cause or maintain many confusions. In any case, such people obviously forget that initiation is derived from initium, a word that properly means entrance and beginning. It is the entrance into a way that will be traversed thereafter, or again the beginning of a new existence in the course of which possibilities of another order will be developed, possibilities beyond the narrow confines of the ordinary life. Understood in its strictest and most precise sense, initiation is in reality nothing other than the initial transmission of a spiritual influence in its seed state, or in other words, initiatic affiliation itself. Recently, another question concerning initiatic affiliation has been raised, but to correctly assess its scope, we should first of all say that it particularly concerns cases where initiation is obtained outside the ordinary and normal channels. And it must be clearly understood, above all, that such cases are never anything but exceptional, and that they occur when certain circumstances render normal transmission impossible, since their raison d'être is precisely to substitute in some measure for that transmission. We say in some measure because such a thing can only happen with individuals possessing qualifications far beyond the ordinary, and aspirations strong enough to in a way attract to themselves the spiritual influence that they would not find if left to their own devices. And also because, for such individuals, it is even rarer still, for lack of the assistance provided by constant contact with a traditional organization, that the results obtained through such an initiation are anything but fragmentary and incomplete. This cannot be insisted on too much, and yet to speak of such a possibility is nevertheless perhaps still not entirely without danger, if only because too many people have a tendency to entertain illusions in this regard. Let an event occur in their lives that is a little extraordinary, or so it seems to them, but that is really rather commonplace, and they interpret it as a sign that they have received this exceptional initiation. And present-day Westerners in particular are all too easily tempted to seize upon the flimsiest pretext of this kind in order to dispense with a regular affiliation, which is why we are quite justified in insisting that as long as this latter is not in fact impossible to obtain, one should not expect to receive any other kind of initiation apart from it. Another very important point is this. Even in such a case, affiliation with an initiatic chain and the transmission of a spiritual influence is always involved, whatever may otherwise be the means and modalities, which no doubt can differ greatly from what they are in normal cases, and may, for example, imply an activity outside of the ordinary conditions of time and place. But at any rate, there is necessarily a real contact, which assuredly has nothing in common with visions or reveries that arise only from the imagination. Footnote. It should be kept in mind further that when questions of an initiatic order are involved, one cannot be too distrustful of the imagination. Whatever has to do only with psychological or subjective illusions is completely worthless in this respect, and should not be allowed to intervene in any way or to any degree. In certain well-known cases, such as that of Jakob Böhme, to which we have alluded elsewhere, footnote, Perspectives on Initiation, Chapter 10, this contact was established by an encounter with a mysterious personage who did not reappear thereafter. Whoever this personage may have been, footnote, it may have been an instance, though certainly not necessarily so, of the appearance assumed by an adept acting, as we were just saying, outside of the ordinary conditions of time and place. To better understand possibilities of this order, see Perspectives on Initiation, Chapter 42. What we have here is a perfectly positive fact, and not simply a more or less vague and ambiguous sign to be interpreted as one likes. But it must be understood that an individual initiated by such means may not have any clear awareness of the true nature of what he has received, or to what he has thus been affiliated. What is more, lacking instructions that could enable him to gain some idea, however imprecise, on all of this, he himself may be quite incapable of explaining the matter. He may not even have heard of initiation, the word and the thing itself being totally unknown in his milieu, but this is basically of small concern, and obviously does not in any way affect the reality of that initiation itself, provided we understand that this kind of initiation presents certain inevitable disadvantages with respect to normal initiation. Footnote. Among other consequences, these disadvantages often give the initiate, especially as regards his manner of expression, a certain exterior resemblance to the mystics, which may even cause him to be taken as such by those who do not go to the heart of things, as was precisely the case with Jakob Böhme. Having said this, we now come to the question alluded to previously, for these few remarks enable us to answer it more easily. Is it not possible that certain books, of which the contents are of an initiatic order, can, for particularly qualified individuals who study them with the requisite frame of mind, serve by themselves as vehicles for the transmission of a spiritual influence, so that in such an instance their reading would suffice, without there being any need for direct contact with a traditional chain, to confer on them an initiation of the type mentioned above? The impossibility of an initiation through books is yet again a point we thought we had sufficiently explained elsewhere, and we must admit that we had not anticipated that the reading of any books whatsoever could be envisaged as constituting one of those exceptional ways that sometimes replace the ordinary means of initiation. Besides, even outside of those particular and special cases where it is properly a matter of the transmission of an initiatic influence, there is here something clearly opposed to the fact that an oral transmission is always and everywhere considered a necessary condition of true traditional teaching, so much so that putting this teaching in writing can never dispense with it. Footnote: in a book, the content itself, as a body of words and sentences expressing certain ideas, is therefore not the only thing that really matters from the traditional point of view. And this because, to be really valid, its transmission implies the communicating of a vital element, as it were, for which books could not serve as a vehicle. Footnote: it might be objected that according to some accounts referring especially to the Rosicrucian tradition, certain books were charged with influences by the authors themselves, which is indeed possible for a book as well as for any other object. But even admitting the reality of this fact, it could in any case be only a question of specific copies especially prepared to that end. Moreover, each of these copies would have been destined exclusively for a given disciple, to whom it was directly entrusted, not to take the place of an initiation, which that disciple would have already received, but solely to furnish him with more effective help when, in the course of his personal work, he would use the contents of the book as a support for meditation. But what is perhaps most astonishing is that this question was raised in connection with a passage about bookish studies, a passage in which we thought that matters were explained with sufficient clarity to preclude any misunderstanding, where we indicated that precisely those books, having an initiatic content, were apt to give rise to such misunderstandings. Footnote: Perspectives on Initiation, Chapter 34. And so it would not seem useless to return to this topic and to explain more completely what we had wanted to say. It is obvious that there are many different ways of reading one and the same book, and that the results will vary accordingly. In the case of a tradition's sacred scriptures, for example, a person who is profane in the most complete sense of the word, such as the modern critic, will view it only as literature, from which he will only be able to derive that kind of exclusively verbal knowledge which constitutes pure and simple erudition, without the addition of any real comprehension of even the most exterior kind, since he does not know, and does not even ask whether what he is reading is the expression of a truth. And this is the kind of knowledge that can be qualified as bookish in the strictest sense of the term. Anyone affiliated to the tradition in question, even if he knows only its exoteric side, will already see something altogether different in its scriptures, although his comprehension may still be limited to the literal sense alone. But what he finds there will be incomparably more valuable for him than any erudition, and this remains equally true for those at the lowest level, who, through an incapacity to understand doctrinal truths, regard them simply as rules of conduct which at least enable them to participate in the tradition to the extent of their possibilities. And yet someone like the theologian, who aims at assimilating the exoterism of the doctrine as completely as possible, and is thus situated at a very much higher level, is still only concerned with the literal sense, and may not even suspect the existence of other more profound meanings, in short, those of esoterism, whereas, on the contrary, someone having no more than a theoretical grasp of esoterism will, with the help of certain commentaries or otherwise, be able to begin to perceive the plurality of meanings contained in the sacred texts, and hence be in a position to discern the spirit hidden beneath the letter. His comprehension, therefore, will be of a much more profound and lofty order than that which is aspired to by the most learned and accomplished of the exoterists. The study of such texts can then form an important part of the doctrinal preparation that normally must precede all realization. But if the one devoting himself to this does not also receive an initiation, he will always be left with an exclusively theoretical knowledge, no matter what predisposition he brings to it, which no amount of study will of itself enable him to surpass. If instead of the sacred scriptures we consider certain writings of a properly initiatic character, as for example those of Shankaracharya or Muhyiddin Ibn al-Arabi, we could, except on one point, say almost exactly the same thing. And so, to take one instance, the only gain that an Orientalist could derive from reading them would be to know that such an author, indeed they are for him authors and nothing more, has said such or such a thing. Furthermore, if he wishes to express this material in his own words, rather than resting content to repeat it verbatim by a simple act of memory, there is the greatest risk that he will deform it, since he has not assimilated its real meaning to any degree. This only differs from what we mentioned earlier in that there is no longer any reason to consider the case of the exoterists, since these writings relate to the esoteric domain alone, and as such are entirely beyond his competence. Were he truly able to understand them, he would by that very fact already have crossed the boundary separating exoterism from esoterism, and then we would, in fact, be in the presence of a theoretical esoterist, of whom we could only repeat unaltered what we have already said on this subject. Nothing remains now but to focus on one last difference, which, however, is not the least important from our present point of view. This is the difference between the reading of one and the same book by both the theoretical esoterist just mentioned, who we will suppose has not yet received any initiation, and by someone who already possesses an initiatic affiliation. The latter will naturally see in it things of the same order as the former, though perhaps more completely, and above all they will appear to him in a different light, as it were. Moreover, it goes without saying that as long as his is only a virtual initiation, he can do no more than simply pursue, to a more profound degree, a doctrinal preparation that had remained incomplete until then. But it is altogether different once he enters into the way of realization. For him, the content of the book is then properly no more than a support for meditation, in the sense one might call ritual, and in exactly the same way as the various kinds of symbols he uses to assist and sustain his inner work. Surely it would be inconceivable for traditional writings, which by their very nature are necessarily symbolic in the strictest sense of this term, not to play such a role as well. Beyond the letter, which has now, as it were, disappeared for him, he will truly see nothing but the spirit, and thus possibilities altogether different from those inherent in a simple theoretical understanding will be as open to him as when he meditates by concentrating on a mantra or a ritual yantra. But if this is so, it is only, we repeat, by virtue of the initiation received, which constitutes the necessary condition without which, whatever qualifications an individual might otherwise possess, there cannot be the slightest beginning of realization, which in short amounts simply to saying that every effective initiation necessarily presupposes a virtual initiation. And we can add further that if it happens that someone meditating on an initiatic piece of writing really enters into contact by its means with an influence emanating from the author thereof, which is in fact possible if the writing originates in a traditional form, and especially from the particular chain to which he himself is attached, this too, far from taking the place of an initiatic affiliation, can on the contrary never be anything but a consequence of a prior affiliation. However we look at it then, there can be absolutely no initiation through books, but only under certain circumstances an initiatic use of books, which is obviously something altogether different. We hope that this time we have sufficiently stressed this point so that not even the slightest ambiguity remains, and that no one will continue to think that there might be something here which lends itself, even if only under exceptional circumstances, to dispensing with the need for an initiatic affiliation.